On Karl Marx and Beyond, Addicted to the Opiate of His Own Perceptions, Part 1. By Neil Max Daves. The following was taken from a dialogue on Karl Marx on LinkedIn. It sparked my interest to attempt to address it in greater detail and in more clarity and balance. A dialogue. From a social media post by an individual I will simply call Mark. Karl Marx wrote that religion is like a sedative opium for people, making them forget about the harshness of life, making people spiritless. For Marx, such religion is man-made and used to abuse people. Explaining Marx's stand on religion, Lenin says that religion is one of the forms of spiritual oppression. Religion is a weapon that blunts the sharpness of human intelligence and the productive capacity of workers. Religion is used by the ruling class as a way of exploiting the masses of people. Many deeply believing Christians would see a lot of truth in that. They see in the Bible a sharp separation between 1. Exterior religion and 2. Deep and spiritual faith, between 1. A man-made focus on ceremonies and doctrine versus a 2. Personal and mystical/intimate relationship between God and man. And indeed I have seen plenty of religious leaders abusing their power to oppress with man-made rules and teachings. Although I do believe deep faith in God and biblical truth is needed for every person and community, a revolt against a man-made, spiritless, and opium-esque religion is something I can sympathize with. A dangerous slope. Mark. Permit me to address your assertions on the quotes you provided on your post. The spirit of the age always attempts to co-opt the essential virtues of the Christian faith to create its own convoluted and confused counterfeits of the real. Once it has gained significant influence and power in a generation, it then turns back to Christian foundations from whence steal from to begin with, to wage war against it through intrigues and machinations within its ranks. Adherents to the various perversions of these Christian foundations always point to the failure of Christians to uphold the very virtues which they themselves have co-opted and perverted to justify their accusations. That is the nature of a lie. What most do not see is the manufactured conditions which are produced by the zeitgeist to create the appearance of its rightness in false light. Let us look closely at these quotes from luminaries of Marxism. Here I will address some historical realities which the zeitgeist used prepped the ground for sowing the ideological winds which would grow out of it, bringing whirlwinds of great consequence. The Pharmaco paradigm, sowing the wind reaping the whirlwind. Karl Marx wrote that religion is like a sedative opium for people, making them forget about the harshness of life, making people spiritless. The ancient Greek word pharmaco means to drug and or poison. We have an irony here. At the time which Marx wrote this, America, Europe and the Far East was enduring a very real epidemic of opiate addiction. It was not limited to opiates, but rather was fueled and amplified by it along with other substance abuses. These epidemics were escalated unintentionally as an effect of the 19th century's wars. Opiates had gained widespread use as a medical treatment for injuries and pain as an innovation born of treating casualties in war. What followed was widespread usage among the broader populations as opiates were increasingly adopted as a standard for treatment of a myriad of ailments. The resulting explosion of addictions was followed by a dramatic increase in moral and ethical entropy across all social classes. Today we are well acquainted with degenerative effects of addiction and epidemics on a society. Then it was hidden and mystery to most. It would be followed by subsequent waves of epidemics, crime and broad-based injustices. This was exploited by the zeitgeist to create the conditions necessary for societal corruption to grow within the very appearances which Marx was observing. Addiction does in fact suck the spirit of life from the addicted. This is clearly seen in our own days as well. However, to attribute the spiritless of people to anything beyond this fact while ignoring it is at best a blind spot in Marx and at worst an intentional negation predicated on confirmation biases and insufficient ideological foundations. Marx's observations were factual until he went on to assume what was causing the things he was observing, thereby attributing the causality wrongly. Likewise, the binary simulacrum of the hyper-religionists and the hyper-secular atheists followed this same cyclical wave as a reaction against the increasing effects of growing corruption and the inherent injustices which inevitably arise from such societal conditions. Marx conveniently ignores this also in his writings, observations and subsequent constructed ideology, choosing instead to base his perspective upon the outward appearances, effects and consequences on society in general. This was faulty on his part and set his perspective on insufficient foundations. Ironically, it worked to his favor, in allowing the zeitgeist to spread the seeds of his ideas around the world by means of global trade routes and commerce. Where these ideas took root and grew, they birthed what would eventually become the socialist, communist and fascist movements in the 20th century, which would lead eventually to the rise of the Soviet Union and Maoist revolution which swept China. This was a sowing of the wind. This is how the zeitgeist prepped the global ideological battlefield. Marx was at the very least misled by the zeitgeist of his time and made a proxy to it in his writings. In reality, opiates themselves and the addictions and the cascade effects born thereof are the seductive opiate of the masses, along with the misguided and often quite evil ideologies born from them and the zeitgeist at work in such societies within all social classes. Might I also add that greed is also an addiction like any other. There is a reason why they all occur at the same time in cycles. For Marx, such religion is man-made and used to abuse people. I would correct Marx here and state that false religion, or rather better said, anything which is not governed by and led by the Holy Spirit of truth, abuses people, be it of the overt religious type, the covertly human-centric religiosity of hyper-secularism, or the overtly hybridized type. As seen in the political theocratic Islamic republics like Iran, which has created an amalgam of Marxism and Shia Islam. Marx was engaged in projective prognostications in this statement. Deception born of intrigues and machinations done by the zeitgeist, are in fact, alongside the depravity of the human condition apart from God Almighty in all truth and love, the source of human oppression of all kinds. He was in fact exposing the reality of what he himself was doing. Creating a man-made human-centric faith in the wisdom of man and the works thereof. There is a reason atheistic regimes use spiritualized language and imagery while denying the actual meta-reality of spirituality itself. It is duplicity at its most potent. Lenin examples this in his statement, explaining Marx's stand on religion. Lenin says that religion is one of the forms of spiritual oppression. The truth here is that both Marx and Lenin were spiritually enslaved to the zeitgeist and projecting the spiritual oppression their ideologies and outworking as such would in fact bring. At once they are exposing their own spiritual enslaved and oppression while unwittingly projecting and predicting the very spiritual oppression Marxism would be the vehicle to cause around the world and in our present day. Religion is a weapon that blunts the sharpness of human intelligence and the productive capacity of workers. This statement too is yet more projective meta-narrative fueled by the zeitgeist which had made them covert spiritual, intellectual and ideological proxies to do its bidding. History clearly shows this to be the case. Religion is used by the ruling class as a way of exploiting the masses of people. Here once again we have the intent of the spirit behind their ideological perspectives revealing what is was doing and would do. Marxist societies have proven this by their actions and outworking every single time. The enslaving by this outworking and oppression of human beings resulting in unparalleled suffering and death is a fact in history which cannot be wished away in any meaningful and intellectually honest manner. Many deeply believing Christians would see a lot of truth in that. On this I refer you to my section on the nature of a lie and how Marxism couldn't defeat the church, so they joined it to co-opt it from within via materialism-based Marxist liberation theology which denies the existential reality of spiritual oppression by spiritual powers and principalities using the machinations of cleverly devised ideologies and systems. Marx and his disciples deny the corruptibility of human nature, including their own, and how the corruption of human nature works like a contagion in the individual as well as their societies and nations made of people. How can say that? Well, by their own words, actions and the fruit of the outworking of their ideas in the finite temporal as seen played out in history. Max, my initial response to Marx. Yet Marx created the man-made ideology which has clearly tried to play God, did he not? How very ironic as well as how very much a failure it was in bidding a workers' paradise. World history is filled with such people, who in the end are buried alongside their pride as the great false lights they were to be consumed by the grave and consigned to the darkness thereof. It is quite amazing how so many of these so-called intellectual giants spend so much of their lives denying the very thing they attempt to become in their own delusions. Now that is irony at its most potent. Mark van Rossum Ph.D. Interesting interpretation. Not sure if it does justice to what really took place with Marx. But later interpretations and executions certainly liken to what he wrote. Mark, to be just to Marx, I cannot hold him complicit with nor supportive with that which his devotees and disciplines did with his ideas. I also cannot cast dispersions upon him personally for the failure of his ideas in their outworking by the application as such by those who attempted to implement his influence. That said, the branches of that tree are not branches without the tree trunk from which they protrude. Likewise it is for the fruit which those branches bear. Temporal time and the history born in it thereof tests and bears witness to their solidity and foundational validity from which the trees of various ideologies spring forth from. Even a fruitful tree has both productive and dead branches. This is true for both secular trees and religions ones. The bushel has both various degrees or good and bad fruit counted among its numbers. This is the great paradox of humanity and its endeavors. Marx's observations include his time were contextually born from his experiences and influences. Like all of us, some are accurate, some unrefined, some contrived from personal ambiguities and others purely subjectively faulty assumption-based. Gill, all ideology is man-made, by definition, Max. These are all ideas unique to humanity, rendered by humans in human form. There are many still today in the world for whom uttering the name of God is blasphemy, attributing the work of man to God is blasphemy. Yes, world history is full of such arrogance. Marx among the very least when all is said and done. If the Roman Church hadn't made such a big deal of Marx in particular, the German princes and European nobility, I'm prepared to wager had those Bolshevik peasants in Russia, nothing at all to do with Marx, hadn't shot Nicholas II Romanov and his family, Marx today would be little more than yet another boring sociology textbook. We have cause to wonder why they bother so, unless to distract attention away from themselves all the time. As things stand, they're extinct themselves, with only a few remnant pretenders still carrying on about all this stuff. I mean, it's all gone, into the dustbin of history as they say. Gill, I often hear the modern-day Marxists speak as though their ideological perspectives are infallible and unquestionable in their righteousness. Most know neither their own ideological foundations nor the actuality of the foundational underpinnings of those whom they find contentious to their own perspectives, while never seeing the gaps in their own points of view. This does not mean they are devoid of truth and factual correct observations. It does mean that their perspectives are mixed, incomplete and insufficient. This is the paradox of the derivative children of others' ideologies. Yet it can be said all ideology is a derivative. The irony with many Marxists' derivatives ideologies is seen in how so many constructions thereof and devotees of them, cast dispersions upon the very ones they have to borrow both language and conceptual notions from. Take for example the notion of justice. No single concept has been used by human ideologies to perpetrate more injustices. Even so the very notion of justice is once firmly planted in moral and ethical foundations which are inherently Judeo-Christian in their origin. It's easy for the secularist to find fault with those claiming to be a Christian who fails to live it out. Yet, these same who claim the moral authority to point out the failure of the Christian or Jew to live out their faith justly then fail to see their own failure to live it out in the implementation of their own quest to perform justice as well, while often denying the very Judeo-Christian foundation stones on which justice must be firmly built upon whom they have taken upon themselves to perform. Justice unhinged from its pure and unsoiled original sourcing and first causality is prone to not only incomplete or insufficient application of it, but also has throughout history caused the greatest injustices in every generation. Ironically in the name of justice itself. As it is for the religionists so too it is for the secularists and atheists alike. This is clearly seen in history, is it not? Wolves in sheep's clothing. Likewise there are many pitiful people who dress themselves up in the garb of various causes, ideologies and theological constructs who know little about them beyond the appearances and machinations which dressing up in them afford the unprincipled and unjust. Are we to apply to all the same standard? The standard without grace is absolute and total perfection in all ways the manner which all live out their ideologies? Are we to each withhold grace from one another in humility and lie of our pride and ideological justifications without concern for the deeper and wider implications? Let us not follow the thou of the fool and the tyrant, for it is a broad way indeed which only continues human suffering and the destruction it brings. The ideology of Marxism is a much different thing over time to consider than the man named Karl Marx from whence it may have been birthed. If we are to put religion on trial as was the case then and since, should we not also hold the prosecution to the same standard which they do so passionately wield in the name of justice against those who see them as having done wrongly if for no other reason by being and professed Christian? Is this not what the Marxists have done historically? On Marxism, justice performed and predicated upon subjective perspective divorced from objective truth, love, mercy and humility will neither yield justice nor resolution. Such falsity will only increase inequities and injustices while fueling more of the same for innumerable generations in bitterness and wrath. For this is the paradox of both religionists and secularist Marxists as well as those who have attempted to unite them in liberation theology. Here, my friends, the fruit is on the tree, and a bitter fruit indeed it is. This we must address first and above all else regarding ideologies, implementation, and their outworking in history within time and space. We must remember that the Nachash, the ancient serpent upon that dreaded tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the garden, was the most cunning and crafty beast in the field. Let us not continue to replay and relive that crime. There is a reason it was a tree, and the tree beheld such bitter fruits. On Karl Marx. Karl Marx wrote that religion is like a sedative opium for people, making them forget about the harshness of life, making people spiritless. For Marx, such religion is man-made and used to abuse people. Explaining Marx's stand on religion, Lenin says that religion is one of the forms of spiritual oppression. Religion is a weapon that blunts the sharpness of human intelligence and the productive capacity of workers. Religion is used by the ruling class as a way of exploiting the masses of people. Many deeply believing Christians would see a lot of truth in that. My response. Yet Marx created the man-made ideology which has clearly tried to play God, did he not? How very ironic as well as how very much a failure it was in building a workers' paradise. World history is filled with such people, who in the end are buried alongside their pride as the great false lights they were to be consumed by the grave and consigned to the darkness thereof. It is quite amazing how so many of these so-called intellectual giants spend so much of their lives denying the very thing they attempt to become in their own delusions. Now that is irony at its most potent. These atheist secularist prophets embody the worst of religion and the most delusional of secularist thinking unified into one singular failed exercise of futility and arrogance. If God does not exist, only a fool would spend their lives trying to disprove the existence of something they say doesn't exist. Is that not an exercise in absurdity? Yet this is what these people do. I hardly met a more religion-obsessed person as a militant atheist. They are consumed with denying the very God they say cannot and does not exist. They are consumed with convincing those who do believe in God that they are wrong and merely simpletons devoid of intellect. How very odd this is. What a terrible state of existence to be confined in. The atheist truly is a pitiful creature to be chained in futility to such hatred towards what they are convinced has no existence. Their passion in this is profoundly irrational, is it not? Raising a standard. One can always find those who fail to live up the standard of their faith. Even those adherents to Marxism. For in every instance they promised so much and delivered so little with great heartache, death, oppression and suffering. How interesting today us Marxists are always trying to convince Christians the tightness of their cause, while history reveals quite another reality altogether. These same atheists are so sure of their belief in themselves and the rightness of their faith that God doesn't exist that they spent their lives trying to prove they themselves are God and convincing others of that fact in their own thinking, never realizing they are proving both the existence of the God they deny and what that God said about them as being true. Thinking themselves wise in their own eyes, they became fools. Then spent their lives proving just how foolish they were until the grave claims them, denying them of their own mortal godhood much like they did themselves to God Almighty. Not one of them have ever resurrected. Yet their ideologies still pollute the world as a false gospel of the arrogant and the damned. The devil's fishing expedition. One cannot go fishing on a vast ocean without using even the smallest of fishing hooks. So too it is with a lie. Even the most obvious lie has some small measure of truth in it. For if it did not, would it exist? Thus is why people are deceived by it. Something cannot be deceptive unless it has something to distort, to deceive, and someone with which to attempt to use it on to deceive into believing it. The devil goes fishing too. The nature of the lie. Just because an ideology has truisms and even some definable truth found within it does not presuppose the ideology nor the intent behind it is inherently based upon truth nor contextually sound in its use of truth. The same holds true for the concept of justice. A lie counterfeits the real things and reframed then in a manner which is intended to deceive. Let us look at the nature of a lie deeper. A lie is not the absence of truth, but rather truth distorted and taken out of context with intent to deceive. Thus is also confusion. Confusion is at its core ignorance or mixing up of original contextual intent and context. All lies are designed to sow confusion. But all confusion experienced by some individual is not born of an intent to deceive. Sometimes it is simply not getting things out rightly due to memory or mistake. However, this too is a result of confusion having been predicated by a first causality, that bring corruption and the world at large and our human vulnerability to it. Likewise it is for ideological constructs. This holds true for Marxism, which has some foundational truths born out of observation glued together with the mortar of personal biases, projection, false assumption and insufficient perception. However, when one looks deeper it becomes clear the ideology was built upon insufficient foundations. If one would like to properly evaluate the ideologies of Karl Marx and their validity, should we not hold his perspective up the same scrutiny which he used in judging religion? After all, if there are to be just and honest in analysis here, we must apply the same standard across the board, should we not? A bare necessity for deeper investigation. Let me put it this way. If I were to dress up as a bear and prowl around on all fours in a national park, would that make me a real bear? Or would it simply mean I was some fool dressed up in a realistic bear costume pretending to what I was not? What if I were to do so and various visitors to the park spotted me, stopped and began to take video and pictures of me, mistaking me for the being a real bear, having never seen a bear in the wild nor getting close enough to make a proper observation of me to see if I were actually a real bear, if still just some crazy fools pretending to be a bear? Does their false assumptions collectively make a real bear out of me simply because these park visitors collectively think me to be one? Of course not. Yet is this not what so many people do on a great many things in their lives? I mean, all it would have taken is a closer inspiration and some research into the behavior patterns of actual bears to see through my ruse. Yet who would take the time to do so, being quite assured that what they saw was indeed a real living breathing bear? They would tell their friends and family about their sighting and even produce photographic and videographical evidence as proof. Those people would assume their friend or family members had told them the truth, never considering the possibility, nor questioning whether or not the bear was a real bear. Now this cascade would continue on and on with no further investigation by anyone, with everyone assuming the park visitor's story as genuine. Yet in this case all of them would have been deceived. The bear was just some fool dressed up in a bear costume. The shallows and the depths of the real. Is this ridiculous example not how people are with their observations of other more important and life-changing things in their lives, like ideologies? Anyone can dress themselves up in the garb of an ideology or belief system for innumerable reasons, yet know nearly nothing about them. They may develop their opinions and even construct elaborate theories and ideologies based upon a faulty assumption or poor life experience with which they paint the totality of anything remotely reminiscent of their original bad experience. What if what they observed at the start was not the authentic version, but rather a counterfeit or distorted version of the thing they thought they were observing and experiencing? If they did not observe further and investigate the matter deeper and closer, and they may have no inkling that their perceptions and subsequent assumption upon which they built their theories and ideologies upon were flawed from the beginning. Now imagine those whom become adherents to that flawed belief system or ideological construct. We often call such people devotees or disciples of such men and women whose ideologies influenced them to such a great degree. Fruit on the tree of good and evil. Isn't this the case of Marx? Let us look at his followers from the time of his life to present day. Are we not called to judge a tree by the fruit it bears? And is it not the case that we are to do so in the spirit of truth rather than the spirit of the age? What is the fruit of the tree of his life and ideologies? His tree would say not very good. Some people would even say that fruit is abhorrent and evil. Still others would say that just because the Marxist ideology failed in practice in all of its various incarnations, that we shouldn't cast dispersions on Karl Marx nor his ideologies, because those who followed in his footsteps failed to live up to it properly. However, is this not exactly what Marx himself did on views of religion and the existence of God? Is this not exactly what those who follows in his footsteps did and still do? So what make their views more righteous than those they themselves cast dispersions upon, being Christians in this case, while not holding themselves to the same standard which they judge them? Is this not hypocrisy? Are we to believe that Karl Marx and his ideologies are somehow more evolved and logical than that of many thousands of years of beliefs in God and the theologies of Judeo-Christian beliefs? After all, Marxists have to borrow from the very language sets and beliefs of Judeo-Christian thoughts to postulate and construct their denials of it. Could they not self-generate their own worldview and use of language devoid of the very thing they wish to refute at least? Apparently not. Derivative confusion. This means that Marxist ideologies could not have even been conceived apart from the first causality of the existence of Christian theological constructs, for if they could, they surely would have done so, being that so many Marxists deny even the existence of the God of the Bible. Is this not exactly what a lie is? It has to take something out of context, deconstructing it and then reconstructing it into something different from the original? Is this not the very meaning of a counterfeit? A distortion? Yet these same people claim the authority and intellectual clarity, supreme logic and moral uprightness of their ideologies, even as they cast dispersions on those whose worldview they find detestable, though had to borrow from them nevertheless. Is that not pride and arrogance? In our days the essential atheist Marxist couldn't beat the church, so they joined it and polluted it from within with clever machinations like liberation theology, which has yet again denied the essential heart of Christianity while co-opting it to claim moral superiority over others. This too is a perversion of the Logos. For such Marxist liberation theologians have to elevate certain Christian doctrines over others they deny, ignore or distort to maintain their intent. What is their intent? To inject the very Christianity they had to borrow from at the beginning, to pollute and take it over from within. This is the nature of deception. It is the nature of a lie. Likewise it is the nature of a doomed ideological construct which must borrow and steal from the very thing it is at war against to exist. Such is the core evil at heart of a lie. It is meant to deconstruct, confuse, deceive, divide and destroy. Yet it is trying to do so to the very system of belief it depends on to exist and deny. Now if that sounds convoluted, it certainly is. It is also quite irrational and self-destructive. This is why we say that proclaiming themselves to be wise they became fools. This is why I said earlier that these pitiful creatures are enslaved to a lie and the futility which it brings in spending one's life fighting the very thing they deny exists. The deceived become proxies for the lie they are enslaved to, which uses them to deceive others. This is why they seek to convince and then deceive Christians into their ideologies, which are nothing more than corruptions of what Christians already believe, even if they have a difficult time living it out. Yet these Marxists, who do the same thing, are the first ones to point out the failures of Christians and others who do not conform to their own insufficient understanding of Christianity, even as they steal from Christianity to accuse, abuse, confuse and deceive them. That, my dear friends, is a way of the Shash, the ancient serpent also called Satan, operates. Satan is the father of lies, the accuser of the children of God, and comes to kill, steal and destroy. No religion is a religion by another name. How can this be? Well, it's also why I said these individuals under the domination of such ideologies are driven by the zeitgeist to deny the existence of God in order to pretend to be God and gain followers. Are we to believe Karl Marx is the secular saint so many believe him to be in both secular and religious circles? After all, there is reason they are all coming together in their present combined causes to wage war against all who do not bend a knee to their corruptive demands and delusional ideological points of view, though most have not the least bit of understanding as to where what they believe comes from beyond what they never questioned but seemed right in their own eyes. This is what you seeing play out right now before your very eyes. You are flooded with it in many of your churches, synagogues, mosques, schools, social circles, on social media and by the news media. So I ask you, is what you say you believe based upon seeing what looked like a bear at the national park, or have you looked deeper only to find that it was not a bear at all? Just some damn fool dressed up to look like a bear at what at first look seemed to be a real bear. For those who don't look deeper, you might just find out the fake bear is a great deal more dangerous than the real bear and be torn to pieces by your false assumptions and the delusions which they inevitably bring. The departed ones. Some among our own ranks have departed from the truth and become proxies for the liars, sons and daughters of the spirit of the age. Were you not told this? Karl Marx, having been raised in and steeped in Jewish thought as well Christian theology, may well have gone astray and departed from the faith if he ever had a legitimate faith in any manner to begin with. I cannot judge his heart on this matter, only the fruit of his life in its echoing affects true history to our present day. True freedom and liberty. There is freedom and liberty in Christ Jesus. This is not the case for such ideologies as Marxism and its various anti-Christ incarnations and hybrids seen previously in history and presently in our own days. It is important for the spirit-filled follower of Christ to seek truth in all things and seek the highest good of all others in all things. For only the truth in love brings about justice and mercy from humble and contrite hearts reborn by and led into all truth by and the power of the Holy Spirit, which exposes the deceptions of this present zeitgeist. For it is the light of the Spirit of truth which exposes what was previously hidden by the spirit of the age in the darkness and frees those whom were previously blinded, the minds of those enslaved by that great darkness. Are you starting to see my point here? As it is for people, so too it is for nations. Max Daves. What was the professed so-called Christian communist Gilles' response? He chose to ignore what I wrote to instead personally attack me. This sums up his paradox in doing so what he actually did on the public viewable discussion thread. The intellectually bereft. Don't you just find it ironic when the arrogant and fake expose themselves by ignoring what you put forth for consideration, choosing instead to cast dispersions upon you personally, never seeing the fact they have in fact ceded their credibility to you by trying to tear yours down? That is how pride is exposed in the prideful. It is often the precursor event to great suffering and hardship to be endured by those who chose their pride over humility. Some might even say their own actions act as a potent of troubles which they themselves are blind to due to their pride until the moment those troubles do come upon them like whirlwind of consequences. Denial is always revealed on the light of one's actions, unwritten by the words thereof which reveal them. Truth to those who despise it sets ablaze the dry timber of their pride inside their souls and minds. They are predictable as the consuming of paper in a furnace by the flames thereof. Such genius has swollen the ranks of hell for many a millennia. Hell is filled with the souls of both religious and secularists alike, each blaming the other for their final fate. Likewise it is also filled with the souls of Marxists and capitalists who spend eternity fighting over who had done the most harm to humanity during their lives on earth. As it is for people, so too it is for nations. Max Daves.